Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is David Turner, the MD here at RiskNZ. Welcome to this March lunchtime seminar, the first one for 2022, and it's certainly been a very busy couple of months for all of us. I would like to thank and acknowledge, firstly, the support of RiskNZ sponsors who all make this possible. That's CAMS, Protec, SAO Global, Insurance Business New Zealand, F24, Zenek, and our newest key sponsor, Aon. So welcome aboard, Aon. Great to have you. All participants have been put on mute, but please feel free to type questions straight into the Q&A panel anytime during the session. We'll be having a Q&A session towards the end of the presentation. So now on to today's very exciting topic. Learning from everyday work, new view of safety discussion, white paper. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to a friend of mine, somebody who's been on the RiskNZ board for some time, who's an expert in this field, Brent Sutton. Brent, take it away.
Thanks, David. Okay, welcome everyone. There we go. Perfect. Okay, thank you for this. And look, it's great to be a speaker on the first autumn as well. So the first day of autumn, looking forward to it. So welcome everyone. And it's good to see some old faces there coming through. And look, today we want to have a conversation about some of the humanities component of risk management. And I'd like to kick that off by sort of asking people if they want and participating in a Q&A. Is risk management science or an art? What are people's thought? Is it a science or an art? So this is your opportunity. If you can go into the Q&A session if you want, and do that. Because many of us think about risk management more as a form of a science. But in actual fact, the science of risk management comprises of the formal tools and the techniques that we use to identify and evaluate and monitor those potential threats to the organization. But the art of risk management comprises of those, what I call those softer skills that are needed to identify and manage the more qualitative component or the people-related risks, and to effectively integrate that with their business strategy. For example, if I was to explore reputational risk management, the art component is important for understanding both the organizational and the stakeholder politics. It's important for effective communication to influence customers and public perceptions of our brand. And it's also important for developing those types of trust-based relationships that are important when the organization has little control over the day-to-day actions of its employees or suppliers. Whereas the science part is for that effective use of the IT and information systems to be able to capture and analyze and monitor data on those reputational risks, and to ensure that data systems are adequately protected against cyber attacks, malware, and other security breaches, and then to apply those more formal risk analysis techniques to those reputational forms of risks. And I sometimes ask the question, are we getting the balance right between science and art? And I think it's a really puzzling thing. In the world of safety that I spend a lot of time in, I frankly feel that it's disproportionate, that so much time is being put into the science of safety versus the art of safety. So, but what's important to us, if risk management is both a science and an art form, when is the best time to learn? And in many organizations, they struggle to actually think about, when does our risk management learn? So let's explore that. And this is what the white paper explores. What the white paper explores is it basically says, think of the organization basically as an iceberg. And what becomes really relevant is that when events happen, those events become visible above the waterline. And a lot of our current risk management techniques are focusing on the things that sit above the waterline. But below that waterline, there are lots of things that are happening every day. And the things that sit below the waterline are the things that we call weak signals. So when an event happens, those weak signals become strong signals and they become obvious to everyone at that point. But why aren't those weak signals obvious to us when they sit below the waterline? And I think part of that, and the bit that we're exploring in the white paper, is part of that is that we're taking more of a science-based approach to trying to understand what sits below the waterline. And we use different types of techniques and different types of tools to do that. And these are some examples of those types of tools, whether it be audits, observations, questionnaires, corrective action. We love good reporting, don't we? We want people to report stuff. But at the end of the day, all those things are based on an intervention. So the people that are exposed to the risk are having to bring it to the attention of the organization, or the organization is having to intervene to better understand. And I really question, is that part of our problem? So if I look at, for instance, reporting as a classic situation, we want people to report more things because we believe that if people report things, it provides us with an opportunity to learn. Yet there have been plenty of science papers that have been published that talk to us about why reporting systems don't function very well. And here's a really good example. If you've got an operation where people are doing lots of problem solving, take, for instance, the healthcare sector might be a good example, where those frontline people are always having to problem solve. Well, when we're trying to report something, that means that the person is having to acknowledge that they are no longer capable of solving the problem and they have to get someone else to solve it for them. So that's the first barrier to reporting. The second barrier is that if they did report, would they be involved in any form of feedback? And then the third barrier, if they did report, would they be involved in the solution, or would the solution simply be rolled out and affect them in that way? So a lot of our intervention models really create what I call those barriers that exist. And I think COVID has really emphasized just how brittle our systems are, because those systems were never designed for the level of complexity that might exist, that happens when we go through these changed or altered states. And that's because at the moment, there's an argument that's going around about whether the role of the system, the thing that helps us to manage risk, is the role of the system to learn from how the work is happening every day, or if people deviate from the expectation of the system, are we simply trying to correct those people to follow what the system approach is? So we've got two arguments that are going at the moment, and I would put to you that if we're trying to deal with lots of what we call dynamic risk or very complex risk environments, in actual fact, the system has to learn. For the system to build that resilience or to build that capability, it has to learn to what's happening every day. There was an interesting paper published by Professor Eric Holnagel last year, where he basically explored from a safety context that organizations spend most of their time looking at events above the waterline, and they focus on accidents, incidents. And he basically argued in his paper that if your learning is only based on what went wrong, then you're always going to see a low frequency of those events, and you're going to see a low similarity of conditions across those events. What he argued was that if you want to better understand how your systems are supporting people, you actually need to look at what is happening in everyday work, because we are more successful than we are unsuccessful. And for instance, there was an author, a chap called Professor Jans Rasmussen, and he wrote the book called The Taxonomy of Human Error. And he explored that human error in a rules-based culture, so a culture that was predominantly driven by policies, procedures, and rules, the error rate was approximately 1 in 1,000. So 1 error for every 1,000. And what he explored in that is that error rate came about because of misunderstanding or misinformation. What he then looked at was this culture around a knowledge-based system. And what he found in a knowledge-based culture was that the error rate went from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 10,000. So where people had much deeper knowledge and understanding about the type of work they were doing and the types of risks they were facing, the error rate dropped dramatically. And that 1 in 10,000 was primarily put down to distraction, which is pretty much a normal human condition. So what Eric Holnagel is saying is that if you're focusing on the things that happen above your waterline, then you're missing out on all the opportunities to learn from what's happening in every day. But how can we do that? Because the problem that we're faced with is that if the error rate is 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000, how do we go out and understand what is happening in everyday work? So in the white paper, Learning from Everyday Work, what the authors have proposed is that things that sit above the waterline, the job of the organization is to lead, but the things that happen below the waterline, it is the workers, it is the people that are exposed to the risk that lead, and it's the role of the organization to support in that way. And that is interesting because if you think about it, it is workers that are having to deal with everything that sits below the waterline every single day. And it's those workers who have a much more intimate knowledge of what happens in daily practice. And sadly, that daily practice is hardly ever reflected in our operational manuals or our policies or our procedures. So one of the things that we proposed is to be able to learn from every day. We need to be able to gather that operational intelligence or those business insights from people. And what we proposed as one way of gaining that from people was about a people engagement model where we basically captured their stories, in other words, their narrative, that it wasn't about people reporting things. It was about people sharing with the organization the things they're having to deal with on a daily basis. And we're going to explore some different versions of that. The first one we're going to explore is a concept called weak signals, the 4Ds. We're then going to explore something called routine work, and then we're going to explore something called risk capacity. So let's start off by talking about the 4Ds. And the purpose here is that by capturing what workers share with us, we want the organization to make sense of those weak signals by seeing those patterns or clusters of worker stories. But at the same time, we want workers to be able to self-improve. And one of the good ways to get workers to self-improve is to get them to critically think and critically reflect about the work they do every day. And the purpose of that is to move them from the system they currently operate in, which is all about evaluating or assessing, to a system where they're actually performing what's called critical appraisal. So a good example would be a checklist. A checklist by its nature is simply taking someone through a sequence. The problem is what learning can happen from a checklist, because the way the checklist is designed, it doesn't encourage learning. So in fact, the checklist is forcing the person to make some sort of evaluation or assessment, rather than being able to critically appraise the purpose of the checklist or how the checklist is supporting that person in their everyday work to be successful. So the example of the 4 Ds, what we're wanting to do is we're wanting workers to share with us things that are dumb, difficult, different, or dangerous. What does that mean? We're asking them to share with us when a situation doesn't make sense to them, being the dumb. We want them to share with us when they encounter something that is unusual or more difficult in the task. We also want them to share with us when they come across a changing situation or a changing activity. And then lastly, we want them to share with us when something just doesn't feel right in that space. This in particular is becoming more important as we start to have to better manage some of the psychological risks that we're dealing with workplaces at the moment, where people as we go through this pandemic, people basically really are looking for ways to help build that resilience and their capability in dealing with the uncertainty that pandemics introduce. So all we're asking people to do is share with us a story around that. The thing about the 4 Ds is we're getting people to critically think about the work they do every day and in what type of situations those things arise. So in this example, in this case, this organization, they basically had a very simple app on a device. And by the way, this app was actually built by the workers. And in the app, all they're doing is they're basically choosing whatever it was, and they're sharing with us their observation. And in this case, the way the app functions is they simply push the microphone button and it records their voice. They can capture an image or they can capture a video. But more importantly, what the workers wanted to do is they wanted to share with us about how important was it to them, which is really interesting. How important was it to them? And at the back end, then the organization is basically seeing that data. So in this case, what happens is that as they share their observations or their stories, there's some AI technology that is basically stripping out the keywords from those stories. So for instance, we had an example where the word mask kept coming up in this environment. So this was an environment where the organization basically is providing some passenger services, and people are constantly dealing at the moment with issues around masks. So it was no surprise that masks kept coming up. What was a surprise though, is that the AI technology was indicating that a large percentage of the stories that were being shared by the workers was a negative sentiment. In other words, how they told their story was in a negative frame rather than a neutral or a positive frame. But also interesting is about 40% of the stories that were shared with us was actually in a neutral or a positive frame. So 2 things came from that. One is the organization was able to look at masks. It was able to look at the context of it where it was being negative, and what they could see were the stories that workers shared. Now, in this case, it was actually really interesting. In this situation, there were people that were wearing masks with racial slogans on them. There were people who basically wouldn't wear their mask correctly. So what it told us was that 60% of those workers weren't coping well with mask wearing. But this is where it gets with a twist, because 40% of those workers were coping. So rather than the organization going out and doing a traditional investigation or a traditional, findings or a traditional intervention, what they actually did, they went out and they spoke to the 40% of the people that were coping and tried to find out from them, what was that secret sauce? What was that thing that helped them in coping every day? And then they applied that with the groups that weren't coping. And that I found really fascinating, because by organizations sharing the positive side of it, it actually helped those workers cope better and build resilience. But more importantly, what we also found was that by workers were able to share their story, they felt their ability to influence the risk actually improved over time. Whereas before, they basically felt that they were having to simply implement a rule. And basically, they were the only person or the only people that were having to deal with the downside of implementing that rule. The second component is this concept called routine work. And what routine work is about is it's basically saying that the routineness of things that we do every day, how we go about doing things, doesn't actually create the environment for learning. In actual fact, I would share with you that the routineness of it actually reduces the ability to learn. And what we want to explore with this notion of routine work is, how do we keep those risks alive? So I remember an example that I came across around cybersecurity and around passwords. And the security team would go around the computers once a night to check to see if you'd logged in and logged out. And if you hadn't logged out, a red balloon was left on your desk. And if you had logged out, a green balloon was left on your desk. Now, when I looked at that, it didn't sit comfortably with me, because in actual fact, the organization felt that it was a learning opportunity for those people that didn't log out correctly, so they could go back and look at the policy. My view was it was actually a form of what I'll call passive bullying, because you were highlighting to others a person not following a rule. Now, what's interesting is that if that organization's method of managing that risk was reliant purely on human behavior, i.e., people remembering to log out, was that the failure of the person, or was it the failure of the organization? My view is it's a failure of the organization, because if the organization wanted to make sure that those computers could not be accessed when the user was not present, it should have put in place some form of control that did that log out automatically. But in actual fact, they then treated those people through that notion of human failure. They actually treated them in such a way that they treated them in a negative context rather than a supportive context in that way. So the concept of that routineness of risk that we manage is a reflective practice where we get people to look back over a period of time to make that variability visible to learn from. In other words, when we talk about variability, this is notion of work as imagined, which is what exists in our policies and our procedures, versus work as done, which is what people have to do to be effective and efficient in the work they do every day. And it's no surprising that when an event happens, we actually discover that work as imagined and work as done was actually quite different. I would argue that that actually changed over time regardless, that there's always going to be a gap or a difference between how the organization believes things are being done how people are following rules or following systems or following process versus how people have to. So the whole idea here is to get people to use a reflective practice to do that. And the way that we do that is we get them to share with us, thinking about a period of time. We ask them some questions about when things didn't make sense to them, when things didn't work as expected, when things were harder, or when something just didn't go how you expected it to go. And we get them to share with us that story. And then we get them to reflect on that story by looking at a series of what we call organizational factors. So for instance, if they shared with us the fact that they had to leave early because their child had become a close contact at an early childhood factor, we wanted to explore with them, was that pressure to perform, did that come from yourself? Did that come from your team? Did that come from your management? If we think about workers, were they having to take risks? Were they having to manage risks? Or were they having to introduce risks? And all we're trying to do here is we're trying to get them to reflect on that, because part of that reflection process is to basically create a different form of situational awareness. And by getting them to reflect on that, we actually help them to build some critical thinking skills. And critical thinking skills are really important to us. And the problem that we have with rules is that rules actually get rid of our ability to critically think, when in actual fact, when we're dealing with lots of things that are changing and lots of situations that continue to change, it is that critical thinking skill that we actually rely on. I would argue strongly that humans can't see an error coming. They only know it's an error after it's gone wrong. But the thing about critical thinking skills allows us to see that something is moving away from its normal state, and it gives us that capacity or that ability to ask why. So it's not about a person being able to learn about all the different ways things can go wrong. It's about their ability to see when something moves away from normal, that they can stand back and ask themselves why. Then the last component that sat around there was this really interesting one, which we call defense capacity assurance. And what is that doing? It's trying to understand, why is our risk management actually functioning? Now, this is an interesting one. In the world of safety in particular, a lot of risk management is based on the absence or presence of harm. So the fact we either haven't hurt people, or we've only hurt this many people in a period of time. I personally find that to be a very poor way of looking at risk management, because in actual fact, the question you should be asking is, why are people being more successful rather than being unsuccessful? And what controls are present that support people to be successful? And the way we look at that is we get people to think about, what are the organizational defenses? So what are the things that the organization believes that it puts in place to help people to be successful? The second component, what is the nature of the types of dynamic risks those workers are having to deal with every day? And the third component is, what are the worker defenses? What are the things that workers are relying on every day? Because that bit in between where those things form, that's actually the stuff that really matters. So the organization can have a whole list of things that it believes it's putting in place to help people to be successful. But what are the things that workers are relying on? And we call that STRM, stuff that really matters. because that's what people look to, and that's what people fall onto when things start not to go, when things start to move away from normal. And the way that we do that is we get people to recall their current state of knowledge. So we get them to share with us what are they currently relying on to be safe, or for the system to support them. The second component is to get them to reflect on some past experiences. So get them to reflect when something didn't go as well as intended, when something didn't make sense, when something was different, or something was more difficult. We get them to resonate with that alternative information. So we get them to ask themselves why. So why was a difference between what they thought worked versus what they encountered? What was that variability? What was that different? And through that power of conversation, we then basically build what's called a future state of knowledge. So the person can now see, in this case, in many instances, what they discover is they discover what is the purpose of some of these organizational defenses that exist, or mitigations or controls. And through that conversation, that then allows those people to apply that new state of knowledge. And at the same time, the organization learns lots of good information through that practice. So, questions from people, because I know this comes across as being maybe a little bit sort of quite spacey or a little bit different. Are there any examples of risks you'd like to explore? And we'll have the full link to the white paper available to you at the end of the conclusion of this webinar as well. And the white paper is free to download, or if you want a printed version of the white paper, you can also access it from amazon.com as well, .com.au. So are there any questions from the participants today around that?
Brent, just while people are thinking of questions, I just really like the presentation, and especially around the STRM, critical thinking, and especially around that red and green balloon scenario. And that really made me think about how are organizations putting it in. And what I mean is, do you see a lot more uptake in that way of thinking, or is it something that needs a bit more education on a grand scale?
In the world of safety, it's actually been quite innovative at the moment. But where it has taken off in safety in particular is actually around psychological risks, that whole psychosocial risk component. And what I found interesting, David, is that a lot of traditional risk management has been trying to fix a problem. And in particular with psychosocial risks that people are facing, these risks aren't fixable by nature. They are simply better understandable. So what we've seen in some of these examples, particularly if I go back to the one about the passenger component, we were able to measure how a person felt. And then as they went through this process, 3 months later, we went and measured how they felt again. And there was a dramatic difference. And what that meant was that they shifted from not being able to cope or feeling helpless within the system to basically saying that the system was able to support them. This is what they've learned. And as a result, they've become far more resilient. Because what they realized was that they can't change the members of public they have to face every day. That's beyond their control. It's beyond their capacity. But through the power of conversation and by working with other people and sharing their stories, they actually felt much more connected in that.
Right. No, thanks very much, Brent. That clears it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. But this approach can work for any type of risk. which I think is really important, whether it be, cybersecurity, financial risk, all types of things. Because if you're relying on humans to be an integral part of your risk management process, then we really need to better understand why they're successful in that. And what we've found is that people being recognized as the experts in the work they do every day, and by getting people to actually have these conversations in teams or smaller groups, it actually widens the conversation and people see a much broader context. And what excites me, particularly around the defence capacity, is for the very first time, it actually recognised and gave comfort to boards about what risks are actually functioning and what aren't functioning. So I have one example, an organisation that deals with high voltage live power. And it's fair to say that in their work, people are having to be exposed to high voltage every day. So in their risk management approach, they were trying to get that balance between mitigations that were trying to prevent that event from occurring, mitigations that were having to respond to that event, and also mitigations that were trying to recover from that event. But the problem that they had is that every time those prevention controls didn't work, but the response and recovery controls did work, they actually went through an investigation process. And when they actually sat down and asked the workers how they felt about that, they actually all came back and said, well, we feel that we've been blamed. That we don't celebrate the fact that the system did work as intended. Because if there is live power, it's a question of when it can go wrong, not if it can go wrong. Two questions here from Nicholas. Can you discuss the story workers tell versus management understanding of a situation? Look, absolutely. The problem that we have, Nicholas, in this situation is that lots of things that we do, lots of our reporting, lots of our investigations, all the things that we do, they lack context. And the reason why they lack context, particularly with things like audits and observations, is that the person is writing things in their language. They're not hearing it from the people themselves. I think a classic example, I've been working with an organisation where they use a timeline to explain things that go wrong. Well, the problem with a timeline, it's a retrospective construction of the event, looking at it at the point of the stick, looking back. But all it does is simply talked about the action items or the failure points, and it didn't give any context. So what they've done now, they're using a concept called a narrative ladder. And what the narrative ladder does is that for each of those action blocks, in other words, the failure point that occurred, the left side of the action block, it explores how was the system supporting at the time. And the right side of the block explores where did the worker see themselves in the system at that time. So in this case, a worker was exposed to a live machine because the padlock wasn't fitted to the machine to de-energize, take the power away. Well, the left side, the system, the supervisor that holds the padlock was actually off ill with COVID, and the backup supervisor was 15 minutes away, and the job only takes 3 minutes. On the left side of the box, the worker had never met this other supervisor. Therefore, his actions were that I'm now going to take 15, 20 minutes to find this person, get the padlock, do it. This is 3 minutes. But more importantly, in the words of the worker, it's never gone wrong before. Why would it go wrong now? That narrative is what made that huge difference for the management understanding. Because so much of what we do doesn't actually capture the voice of the people that are exposed to the risk. Got a little bit more time if people want to ask any other questions. So hopefully that helped you, Nicholas. How can we be agile around this? I think that's a really interesting question. What we've been trying to explore is that all organizations have limited resources. So the reason why we're trying to explore this concept of weak signals is how can technology help us to recognize patterns? Because humans by nature aren't really good at seeing patterns until it's gone wrong. But where humans are really good is at being able to read the context of those patterns to get a better understanding. So the agile component is the fact that the systems can go out and capture lots of stories from people because people want to participate. And the organization can see those key themes or those key threads that are emerging from it. That's what makes them agile. And then they can go out and spend a bit of time understanding it. When people say to me all the time, we want people to report more things, I ask the question, how long does it take you to follow up on a report at the moment? And then ask a second question, how many reports could you actually handle before you ran out of capacity? In actual fact, organizations have actually discovered that if they did get people to report, which they don't, but if they did get them, they did not have the capacity or the resources to follow through, which put them back into that same deficit model. So I think the power of conversation is what allows us to be agile in that space, rather than following a process. And on our website, learningteamscommunity.com, there's actually a video of a real life example of a construction environment as well, so people can see about how some of these things were applied in practice, where workers on the sites were being asked to perform daily checklists or daily quality audits or daily this or daily that, and of course no one really bought into it because they saw it simply as a form of compliance. But when we asked them what bits they found valuable about it, what they found valuable was actually the ability or that time to actually have a group conversation. The sad thing was that these things they filled in, these reports they filled in, went into a box. That box went into a container. And on the site in question, they'd actually ran out of space in the container. They had to go out and buy a bigger container. So the sad thing there is workers basically said, well, if management's not doing anything with the stuff that we're filling in, then it doesn't provide any value to us. So got a question here, talking about weak signal indicators. Where do you see corporate governance safety reporting trends going in the future? E.g. the shift from lag to lead indicators, what next? Look, I think that's really important. And I challenge you in this way. The future is always uncertain. So any indicator that could predict the future is a fool's errand. One of the things that we've been working on is two new types of metrics. One's called an informational metric, which is there to inform us about something. And the second component is what's called an actionable metric, something that allows us to do something with it. And what those metrics are focusing on is they're focusing on the present, not the past. Because if we better understand the present, that allows us the opportunity to try and influence the future. So rather than talking about lag and lead indicators, we talk about indicators that really tell us more about what is the present. What's happening in the present, in the moment, because that would allow us to potentially influence the future. Events or investigations are really looking at the past. And the problem with looking at the past is that hindsight allows us to become experts, and hindsight allows the thing that went wrong to become very visible. And it also puts that organization into that power model of basically blame or even accountability. By understanding what's happening in the present and supporting people to focus on more about why things go right rather than why they go wrong, it actually supports both the organization and the people to actually self-improve. And I'd like to share with you, that is the true notion of continuous improvement. So rather than waiting for it to go wrong to learn from it, we're actually learning about why it's going right to build on it. Oh, if there's any other questions, David, I think we're coming up to time.
Hey, thanks very much, Brent. I really enjoyed that, and I'm sure everybody did as well and got a great deal of value out of that. Look, I just want to say thank you, Brent. That was very, very interesting today. Thanks for everybody for coming along. It's been a great turnout. This webinar has been recorded and will be sent out to you in the next couple of days. And of course, if you're not already a member of Risk New Zealand, we'd love to have you contact us, become a member, or if you know anybody else who'd like to become a member, get in touch as well. So thank you again, everybody, for being here today. Have a great day, and I'm certainly sure we'll see you shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.